The radar screen flickered with impossible data. Colonel Marcus Thorne stared at the green blip materializing through static, his weathered face reflecting the amber glow of the command center's displays. 3 hours earlier, he had watched four A-10 Thunderbolt IIs disappear into the maw of a Category 5 storm over the Helmand province. The mission was supposed to be routine, close air support for a stranded reconnaissance team pinned down by Taliban forces in a remote valley. But nothing about this day had been routine. "Sir, we're getting a transponder signal," Technical Sergeant Rodriguez called from his station, his voice tight with disbelief. "Aircraft designation Hog 47, but that's impossible, sir. We lost all contact 47 minutes ago." Thorne's jaw clenched. Hog 47. He knew that call sign, knew the pilot who flew under it. Captain Nick's Reaper Caminos, a name that drew snickers in the officers' club, where pilots with half her flight hours questioned whether someone barely 5'4" could handle the raw power of a warthog. They called her the desk jockey's daughter behind her back, referencing her father's Pentagon career, suggesting she'd earned her wings through connections rather than skill. The irony wasn't lost on Thorne that the same men who mocked her Greek heritage and questioned her place in the cockpit were now silent, watching radar screens that showed only empty sky where four aircraft should have been. The storm had materialized with biblical fury, transforming a clear morning into a maelstrom of 90-mile-per-hour winds and zero visibility. Weather satellites showed a rotating wall of destruction that stretched from ground level to 30,000 feet, a meteorological anomaly that had caught everyone off guard. Standard protocol demanded immediate abort, but the ground team's desperate radio calls had painted a picture of imminent annihilation. Taliban fighters were closing their position, and extraction was impossible until the enemy was neutralized. Thorne had made the call to send the A-10s. 4 pilots, 4 aircraft, 4 chances to save 12 American lives trapped in a valley that had become a death trap. The last transmission had been routine. Hog flight, target acquired, beginning attack run. Then nothing but the white noise of cosmic interference and the colonel's growing certainty that he had just sent 4 pilots to their deaths. Now, 3 hours later, something was painting the radar scope. Something that couldn't exist, shouldn't exist, yet there it was. A single aircraft limping through airspace that meteorology insisted was still choked with 100-knot winds and visibility measured in feet rather than miles. The signal wavered, disappeared, then strengthened again, like a ghost materializing from another dimension. "Rodriguez, get me tower control," Thorne commanded, his voice steady despite the impossible situation unfolding before him. "And prep the crash crews. Whatever's coming home isn't coming home clean." The base's emergency sirens began their haunting wail as impossible became inevitable. Something was indeed returning from the storm, but what exactly, and in what condition, remained a mystery that would soon shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew about courage, skill, and the thin line between legend and reality. Captain Nix Camninos had earned her call sign Reaper, not through the grim harvest of enemy lives, though she had claimed her share, but through an uncanny ability to appear at the precise moment when death seemed certain, both for her enemies and her allies. Born to Greek immigrants in Queens, she had grown up translating English for her grandmother while simultaneously devouring every aviation manual she could find. Her father, Colonel Andreas Camninos, had indeed carved out a respectable Pentagon career, but Nix's path to the cockpit had been forged through pure obsession rather than family connections. She had soloed at 16, earned her private pilot's license before her driver's license, and spent her college years flying crop dusters to pay for advanced ratings. The Air Force had initially tried to steer her toward transport aircraft, more suitable for someone of her stature, the recruiting officer had suggested with barely concealed condescension, but Nix had other plans. She aced every physical requirement, outscored her male counterparts on technical examinations, and demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to coax performance from aircraft that lesser pilots would have written off as unflyable. Her first squadron commander had been skeptical until the day she dead-sticked a battle-damaged A-10 onto a highway in Iraq, saving not only her own life, but also preventing the aircraft from crashing into a refugee convoy. The landing had been captured on helmet camera footage that still circulated through military aviation circles like an urban legend. Watching 5 tons of titanium-bathed aircraft settle onto asphalt with the grace of a feather had earned her grudging respect from pilots who had previously questioned her presence in their ranks. But respect in military aviation was a fragile commodity, constantly requiring renewal through demonstrated competence under pressure. Every mission became a test, every flight a proving ground where one mistake could resurrect whispers about quotas and political correctness. Nix had learned to let her flying speak louder than her words, to answer skepticism with precision, and to transform doubt into deadly effectiveness when the stakes demanded nothing less than perfection. The storm had caught Hog Flight at the worst possible moment, gear down, flaps extended, committed to their attack run when meteorology's worst-case scenario materialized around them with the speed of divine wrath. Wind shear had scattered the formation like leaves, transforming precision flying into a desperate struggle for basic survival. Radio communications dissolved into static chaos as each pilot fought their own private battle against forces that could shred aircraft like tissue paper. Now, emerging from that maelstrom with her aircraft bearing wounds that should have been fatal, Nix was about to discover whether survival was merely the first challenge in a day that had already redefined the impossible. The control tower's radio crackled with a voice that seemed to emerge from another world, weak, distorted, but unmistakably human. Kandahar Tower, this is Hog 47 requesting immediate emergency landing. Declare full emergency. Aircraft is battle damaged and weather compromised. Fuel state critical. Hydraulics compromised. Flight controls marginal. Landing gear status unknown. Request straighten approach runway 27. Master Sergeant Katie Vance, the tower supervisor with 18 years of experience guiding aircraft through every conceivable emergency, had never heard a pilot deliver such a comprehensive damage assessment with such clinical detachment. The voice belonged to someone who had stared death in the face and negotiated terms. Hog 47, Kandahar Tower, we have you on radar. Squawk emergency transponder. State fuel remaining and souls on board. Tower Hog 47, fuel approximately 400 pounds, one soul on board. Be advised, aircraft has sustained significant battle damage and severe weather stress. Control response is limited. May require barrier engagement or emergency arrestment. Vance's eyes widened. 400 pounds of fuel in an A-10 was barely enough for one pass at the runway, maybe two, if the pilot was willing to risk flameout on final approach. She had guided wounded warriors home before, but something in this pilot's voice suggested damage that went beyond hydraulic failures and fuel leaks. This was someone flying an aircraft that existed in the gray zone between airworthy and catastrophic failure. Hog 47 understands single soul on board. Crash crews are standing by. Medical is prepared for pilot extraction. What's your current altitude and distance from field? The response came through waves of static that seemed to ebb and flow like ocean tides. Tower, currently descending through 8,000 feet, approximately 12 miles southeast. Be advised, I'm hand-flying this aircraft on backup controls. Automated systems are non-responsive. We'll need vector guidance for approach. Hand-flying an A-10 through severe weather damage was like performing surgery with sledgehammers. The Warthog was built for punishment, designed to absorb incredible damage and continue fighting, but it was not designed to be graceful. Without computer assistance, landing the aircraft required a combination of strength, timing, and intuition that pushed human capability to its absolute limits. The fact that someone was attempting it after surviving both combat damage and meteorological hell spoke to either exceptional skill or desperation, so complete that death had become preferable to surrender. In the command center, Colonel Thorne monitored the radio traffic while studying radar returns that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The approaching aircraft was deviating from standard flight paths, making constant corrections that suggested either severe control problems or a pilot operating at the very edge of human endurance. Each course change looked like a struggle, a negotiation between human will and mechanical reality that could fail at any moment. The emergency crews were already positioning themselves along the runway, their vehicles forming a corridor of flashing lights and prepared devastation. Fire trucks, ambulances, and crash recovery equipment stood ready to respond to whatever emerged from the approaching storm, whether that was a successful emergency landing or a catastrophic impact that would scatter debris across half the airfield. Through the control tower's rain-streaked windows, the first visual contact appeared as a dark speck against churning gray clouds, growing larger with each passing second. What emerged from that meteorological chaos would challenge everything the assembled personnel thought they knew about the limits of both human endurance and mechanical tolerance. The aircraft approaching Kandahar wasn't just battle-damaged. It was a testament to the thin line between catastrophic failure and miraculous survival, flown by someone who had apparently decided that death was simply not an acceptable option. The approaching A-10 looked like it had been mauled by some prehistoric beast. Through binoculars, the control tower personnel could see daylight streaming through holes in the fuselage, jagged tears in the wings, where shrapnel had carved through titanium armor like butter. The left engine's intake showed visible damage, and what should have been a symmetrical aircraft now displayed the broken geometry of something that had survived forces designed to destroy rather than test. Master Sergeant Vance had seen battle-damaged aircraft before, but nothing quite like this. The Warthog was designed to absorb punishment. Its titanium bathtub cockpit could withstand direct hits from anti-aircraft artillery, and the aircraft could theoretically fly home on one engine with half its control surfaces missing. But the approaching aircraft seemed to exist beyond those design parameters, in a realm where engineering margins met human determination and somehow found a way to keep flying. Hog 47 Tower, we have visual contact. Advise you appear to have significant structural damage visible from the ground. How do you assess aircraft controllability? The pilot's response carried a hint of dark humor that seemed impossible under the circumstances. Tower, Hog 47. Controllability is a relative term. Aircraft responds to control inputs, but not necessarily in ways consistent with normal flight characteristics. I'm basically flying a very heavy glider with anger management issues. Request clearance for straighten approach. Colonel Thorne moved to the tower's observation deck, studying the approaching aircraft through powerful optics that revealed details no pilot should have to contemplate. The right wing showed multiple penetrations, probably from heavy machine gun fire. The vertical stabilizer had lost nearly a third of its surface area. Most disturbing was the visible structural deformation along the fuselage, stress fractures and metal fatigue that suggested the aircraft had been subjected to forces well beyond its design limits. "How the hell is that thing still airborne?" he muttered to Vance, who was coordinating emergency response procedures while maintaining radio contact with what should have been an impossible situation. "Sir, I've been asking myself the same question for the last 10 minutes, she replied, never taking her eyes off the radar scope. "But right now, I'm more concerned about getting that pilot on the ground in something resembling one piece." The A-10's approach was a study in controlled desperation. Each course correction looked like a negotiation between human will and mechanical limitation, with the aircraft's responses delayed and unpredictable. The pilot was constantly making minor adjustments, feeling for control response, testing the boundaries of what the damaged aircraft could and couldn't do. It was flying that required not just technical skill, but an almost supernatural ability to communicate with a machine that was operating well beyond its normal parameters. Hog 47 Tower. Runway is clear, emergency equipment standing by. Winds are currently 270 at 15, gusting to 22. Altimeter setting 29902. Tower Hog 47. Copy winds and altimeter. Be advised, landing may be unconventional. If aircraft becomes uncontrollable, I'll attempt to clear the runway environment. Have crash crews maintain safe distance until aircraft comes to complete stop. The matter-of-fact way the pilot discussed potential catastrophic failure chilled everyone listening. This was someone who had already stared down death multiple times in the past few hours, and was now calmly planning for the possibility that the next few minutes might require even more impossible decisions. The approaching aircraft wasn't just battle-damaged. It was being flown by someone who had apparently decided that conventional limitations no longer applied to their particular situation. As the A-10 lined up for final approach, its damaged silhouette against the gray sky looked less like an aircraft and more like a wounded bird of prey, determined to reach safe ground despite injuries that should have been fatal. The question wasn't whether it would land. The question was whether anyone would survive the attempt. The final approach looked like a controlled crash that someone had decided to call a landing. The A-10 descended through turbulent air with the grace of a brick wrapped in determination, its pilot making constant corrections that kept the aircraft aligned with the runway despite control responses that seemed to operate on their own timeline. Through the radio, those listening could hear the pilot's breathing, controlled, steady, but with the unmistakable tension of someone performing surgery on themselves while falling from a cliff. Tower Hog 47, on final approach. Landing gear appears to be locked down but no green lights. Hydraulics are compromised. This is going to be a full-stop landing whether we want it or not. Master Sergeant Vance coordinated the emergency response with the efficiency of someone who understood that the next 60 seconds would determine whether this became a rescue operation or a recovery mission. Fire trucks positioned themselves along the runway's length, their crews suited in full protective gear and armed with equipment designed to extract pilots from wreckage that might be burning, toxic, or both. Medical personnel waited with stretchers and trauma equipment, prepared for injuries ranging from minor to catastrophic. Colonel Thorne watched through binoculars as the damaged aircraft settled toward the runway with what could charitably be called controlled descent. The approach speed looked high, probably because damaged control surfaces weren't generating the lift they should, forcing the pilot to carry extra airspeed as insurance against stall. The aircraft's attitude was slightly nose-high, suggesting someone who was flying by feel rather than instruments, using every available technique to squeeze maximum performance from systems that were operating well beyond their design limits. Hog 47 Tower, you're cleared to land runway 27, emergency equipment standing by. Fly it all the way to the ground. They'll cross the runway threshold with perhaps 50 feet to spare, its damaged engines producing uneven thrust that created a subtle yaw the pilot corrected with what appeared to be brute strength applied to rudder pedals. The main landing gear touched down with a sound that was part impact, part controlled explosion, rubber meeting concrete at a speed that pushed the boundaries of what either material was designed to handle. What followed was less a landing roll than a barely controlled mechanical disaster that somehow resolved into successful aviation. The aircraft bounced once, settled back onto the runway, and began a deceleration that involved every available technique from aerodynamics to prayer. Thrust reversers deployed unevenly, creating asymmetric forces that the pilot corrected with control inputs that suggested an intimate familiarity with emergency procedures. The landing roll stretched longer than normal. Damaged brakes and compromised aerodynamics meant that stopping distance became a matter of runway length versus physics, with no room for negotiation. Emergency vehicles paced the aircraft as it rolled, their crews ready to respond to fire, explosion, or structural failure. But the A-10 continued its stubborn refusal to acknowledge that it should have crashed hours earlier. The aircraft finally came to a stop approximately 3/4 down the runway's length, its engines winding down with the uneven whine of machinery that had been pushed beyond reasonable limits. For a moment, silence settled over the airfield like a held breath. Then, with the deliberate precision of someone who had planned for this moment, the A-10's canopy began to open. The pilot who emerged from the cockpit moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body was operating on willpower, rather than physical reserves. Captain Nix Comninos climbed down from her aircraft like she was disembarking from a routine training flight. But the medical personnel who reached her first could see the signs of someone who had spent the last several hours in mortal combat with both enemy forces and the fundamental laws of physics. Her flight suit was soaked with sweat despite the cool morning air. Her hands showed the telltale tremor of someone whose nervous system was still processing massive doses of adrenaline. But her eyes held the clear, steady gaze of someone who had stared into the abyss and negotiated terms rather than surrendering to the inevitable. She had survived not through luck or accident, but through a combination of skill, determination, and an apparent refusal to accept that some situations were genuinely hopeless. "Medical's on the way, Captain," the first emergency responder called as she stepped onto the tarmac. "Any injuries we need to know about?" "I'm functional," she replied, her voice carrying the hoarse quality of someone who had been shouting over engine noise and radio static for hours. "But I need to debrief immediately. We've got friendlies still in the field and the situation is—" She paused, searching for words that could adequately describe what she had experienced. "Complicated." Colonel Thorne approached across the tarmac, studying the pilot who had just accomplished something that would become part of aviation legend, assuming anyone could figure out exactly what had been accomplished. She was smaller than he had expected, barely tall enough to see over the A-10's nose without assistance. But there was something in her posture, in the way she carried herself, that suggested size was measured in dimensions other than height and weight. "Captain Comninos," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Colonel Thorne. I think we need to talk." She accepted the handshake with grip strength that suggested someone who had spent the last several hours wrestling with flight controls that required both precision and brute force. "Sir, with respect, talking can wait. We need to discuss immediate tactical situation. The other members of Hog Flight are still out there, and the ground team needs support that they're not going to get unless we act quickly." Behind them, damage assessment teams were already swarming over the A-10, documenting holes, fractures, and failures that painted a picture of survival that defied both engineering analysis and common sense. The aircraft had absorbed punishment that should have been fatal multiple times over, yet here it sat on the runway, cooling in the morning air like some mechanical phoenix that had decided resurrection was simply a matter of proper maintenance and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. But as Colonel Thorne would soon discover, the aircraft's survival was only the beginning of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about courage, capability, and the price of bringing everyone home. The debriefing room fell silent as Captain Comninos described the final moments before Hog Flight had scattered into the storm. Her voice carried the clinical precision of someone delivering a tactical assessment, but Colonel Thorne could hear the underlying emotion: guilt, determination, and something that might have been anger at a universe that demanded impossible choices from people who were already giving everything they had. "The ground team's position was being overrun," she explained, pointing to the tactical map spread across the conference table. "Taliban forces had established positions on 3 sides of their perimeter. Standard extraction wasn't possible, the LZ was too hot, and air mobility couldn't get close enough to provide support. The team leader, Staff Sergeant Morrison, was reporting heavy casualties and requesting immediate close air support." Intelligence officer Major Sarah Walsh studied the satellite imagery with the expression of someone who understood that tactical decisions made in desperate moments often look different when viewed from the comfortable perspective of hindsight. Captain, the weather conditions were already deteriorating when Hog Flight received the mission. What was your assessment of the risk versus potential outcome? Nix's jaw tightened slightly, not from defensiveness, but from the weight of decisions that had carried life-and-death consequences for people she had never met but was sworn to protect. Major, 12 American soldiers were about to die if we didn't act. The weather was bad and getting worse, but it was still flyable. We had maybe a 20-minute window before conditions became impossible. The choice was simple: risk 4 aircraft and 4 pilots, or guarantee 12 KIA. Colonel Thorne had been in enough combat situations to understand the mathematics of military decision-making. Sometimes the equation was brutally straightforward: acceptable losses versus unacceptable alternatives. But what made this situation unique wasn't the decision to proceed. It was what had happened after that decision was made. Captain, walk us through what happened after Hog Flight entered the target area, he said. We lost radio contact with all 4 aircraft approximately 47 minutes ago. Until your aircraft appeared on radar, we had assumed total loss. The silence that followed suggested that Captain Comnenos was revisiting memories that were still too fresh, too raw to be processed as mere tactical data. She had survived something that should have been fatal, but survival was only meaningful if it served a larger purpose. The fact that she was sitting in this debriefing room meant that 12 soldiers might still be alive, but it also meant that 3 of her fellow pilots were still missing, possibly dead, definitely in need of rescue if rescue was still possible. Sir, what happened out there went beyond normal combat operations, she said finally. We're dealing with a situation that's going to require resources and tactical approaches that aren't covered in standard operational procedures. The Taliban forces aren't just well-equipped, they're operating with intelligence and coordination that suggests outside support. And the weather, she paused, gathering her thoughts. The weather isn't behaving according to any meteorological model I've ever encountered. Weather specialist Captain Jennifer Torres looked up from her latest satellite analysis with an expression that suggested Mother Nature had decided to rewrite her own rules without consulting the people who depended on predictable atmospheric behavior. Captain, I've been tracking this storm system since it first appeared on our scope 6 hours ago. Its development rate and intensity don't match any known meteorological patterns. This thing materialized faster than should be possible and maintained coherence through conditions that should have torn it apart. The implications were disturbing on multiple levels. If the weather wasn't following predictable patterns, then rescue operations would have to be planned using assumptions that might prove fatally incorrect. If the enemy forces were better equipped and coordinated than intelligence had suggested, then any rescue attempt might be walking into a trap that could result in even more casualties. And if Captain Comnenos was the only survivor of Hog Flight, then the Air Force had just lost 3 experienced pilots and 3 aircraft in a single mission gone wrong. But as Colonel Thorne was about to discover, assumptions about who had survived and who hadn't were about to be challenged by information that would force everyone in the room to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the day's events. Captain Comnenos reached into her flight suit and produced a small device that looked like a standard military GPS unit, except for the modifications that suggested field engineering performed under less than ideal conditions. Sir, I need to show you something that's going to complicate our understanding of what happened out there. This unit was recording throughout the mission, including GPS coordinates, radio transmissions, and tactical data that standard equipment wouldn't capture. She activated the device, and the room filled with the sound of radio communications that had been recorded during the height of the storm. Through static and interference, voices emerged, call signs that should have been silenced forever, tactical updates that painted a picture of ongoing operations rather than catastrophic failure. Reaper, this is Sledgehammer. I'm still airborne, but I've got multiple systems failures. Hydraulics are gone and I'm losing altitude. Can you confirm position of friendlies?" Colonel Thorne felt something cold settle in his stomach as he recognized the voice of Captain Mike Sledgehammer Rodriguez, Hog 3's pilot. According to every radar track and communication log, Rodriguez should have been dead for the better part of an hour, but the recording clearly indicated otherwise. Sledgehammer Reaper copies. Friendlies are grid November 742 Alpha. Be advised, I'm tracking multiple enemy positions, but visibility is near zero. Can you maintain altitude? The conversation continued, revealing tactical coordination between pilots who were supposedly lost, discussing enemy positions and friendly locations with the precision of ongoing operations. But most disturbing was the timestamp on the recording. These communications had occurred more than 30 minutes after radar contact, with all 4 aircraft had been lost. Major Walsh studied the GPS unit with the expression of someone whose understanding of cause and effect had just been fundamentally challenged. "Captain, this recording suggests that at least 2 members of Hog Flight remained operational well after we lost contact. How do you explain the communications blackout?" "Ma'am, I can't explain it," Nix replied, "but I can tell you what I observed. The storm created some kind of electromagnetic interference that blocked standard radio frequencies while leaving others partially functional. We were able to maintain limited contact using emergency frequencies, but ground-based receivers couldn't penetrate the interference. From your perspective, we had disappeared. From our perspective, we were still fighting." The tactical implications were staggering. If Hog Flight had remained operational after losing contact, then their mission status was unknown rather than failed. The ground team might have received the support they needed, or the situation might have deteriorated beyond recovery. Other pilots might still be alive, might still be flying damaged aircraft through conditions that made survival a matter of moment-to-moment decision-making. But perhaps most important was the realization that Captain Comnenos hadn't survived through luck or accident. She had survived as part of an ongoing mission that was still developing, still requiring tactical decisions that could determine whether today ended with successful rescue or catastrophic loss. Colonel Thorne studied the woman sitting across from him with growing respect and recognition. She hadn't just survived the impossible. She had continued to function as a military pilot under conditions that would have broken lesser warriors. And now, she was asking him to authorize a rescue operation based on intelligence that challenged everything his command structure thought they knew about the tactical situation. The question wasn't whether to trust her assessment. The question was whether they could afford not to. The Tactical Operations Center transformed into controlled chaos as Colonel Thorne authorized immediate search and rescue procedures based on Captain Comnenos' intelligence. Wall-mounted displays flickered to life showing satellite imagery, weather patterns, and tactical overlays that painted a complex picture of ongoing operations in an area that had been written off as an operational loss. The assumption that Hog Flight had been destroyed was being replaced by the possibility that the mission was still active, still requiring command support and strategic coordination. "I need current enemy disposition, friendly locations, and weather analysis updated in real time," Thorne commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood that the next few hours would determine whether this day ended with successful rescue or expanded catastrophe. "And I want every available asset prepared for immediate deployment. We're not leaving anyone behind." Master Sergeant Patricia Chen, the Operations Center's senior enlisted advisor, coordinated communications with multiple agencies while studying tactical data that seemed to change faster than analysis could keep pace. "Sir, we're getting conflicting intelligence from multiple sources. Ground-penetrating radar shows possible aircraft signatures in the target area, but the weather is still preventing visual confirmation. AWACS is reporting intermittent radar contacts that could be aircraft or could be atmospheric anomalies. The challenge was separating reliable intelligence from wishful thinking, in a situation where conventional wisdom had already proven inadequate. Captain Comnenos had survived conditions that should have been fatal while maintaining tactical effectiveness that shouldn't have been possible. But extending that logic to assume that other members of Hog Flight had achieved similar success required faith in capabilities that existed beyond normal training parameters. Captain Torres provided updated meteorological analysis that offered both hope and concern in equal measure. Sir, the storm system is showing signs of gradual deterioration, but it's still generating winds in excess of 60 knots with visibility near zero in the target area. Any rescue operation is going to face the same conditions that scattered Hog Flight in the first place. Flight Surgeon Captain David Kim reviewed medical assessments of Captain Comnenos with the clinical detachment of someone whose job involved determining whether pilots were physically and mentally capable of continued operations. Colonel, Captain Comnenos shows signs of significant physical stress and fatigue, but her cognitive function appears unimpaired. However, I'd recommend against authorizing her for immediate return to flight status. What she's been through today would challenge any pilot's reserves. Nix looked up from the tactical displays with an expression that suggested medical recommendations were secondary to operational necessities. Sir, with respect, I'm the only pilot who's actually been in that operational environment. I know the terrain, the weather patterns, the enemy positions, and the tactical situation better than anyone else available. If you're planning a rescue operation, I'm your best asset for mission success. The argument was compelling on multiple levels. She had demonstrated not just survival capability, but continued tactical effectiveness under impossible conditions. Her knowledge of the operational environment was based on recent direct experience rather than theoretical analysis. But authorizing someone who had just survived what amounted to extended combat operations to return immediately to the same environment raised questions about both human limitations and command responsibility. Colonel Thorne studied the assembled information, satellite imagery, weather reports, tactical assessments, and the steady gaze of a pilot who had already proven that conventional limitations didn't apply to her particular approach to military aviation. The decision he made in the next few minutes would determine not just the fate of potentially surviving members of Hog Flight, but also whether the military was prepared to acknowledge that some warriors operated beyond standard parameters of human capability. Captain Comnenos, he said finally, I want you to plan a rescue operation based on your assessment of the tactical situation, but you're not flying it. We'll find other pilots for the mission. Her response was immediate and predictable. Sir, respectfully, you won't find pilots who know the operational environment like I do. This isn't about courage or capability. It's about tactical knowledge that could mean the difference between successful rescue and additional casualties. I'm not asking to fly because I want to be a hero. I'm asking to fly because it's the most effective way to bring everyone home. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of command decisions that carried life-and-death consequences for people whose names would be remembered either as successful rescues or tragic losses. Colonel Thorne was being asked to authorize something that went beyond standard operational procedures, beyond normal human limitations, into territory where military leadership required faith in capabilities that couldn't be measured by conventional standards. Outside, the storm was beginning to weaken, but the tactical situation remained as complex and dangerous as ever. The rescue mission launched 2 hours later with a precision that masked the unprecedented nature of what was being attempted. Captain Comnenos occupied the lead position in a modified A-10 configured for search and rescue operations, flying alongside 2 additional Warthogs piloted by Major Tom Bulldozer Jackson and Captain Lisa Phoenix Martinez, both veterans with extensive combat experience who had volunteered for an operation that pushed the boundaries of tactical sanity. The flight plan looked deceptively simple on paper. Proceed to the last known coordinates of the ground team, locate and assess both friendly and enemy positions, determine the status of missing Hog flight members, and coordinate extraction operations. Reality, as everyone involved understood, would prove considerably more complex than planning documents suggested. Kandahar Control, rescue flight is airborne and proceeding to target area, Nix reported as the three-aircraft formation climbed through turbulent air that still carried the residual effects of the morning's meteorological chaos. Weather conditions remain marginal but flyable. Estimate time to target area 15 minutes. Flying back into the environment that had nearly killed her required a level of psychological resilience that went beyond normal pilot training. But Captain Comnenos approached the mission with the same clinical detachment she had demonstrated throughout the crisis, not because she lacked emotion, but because effective tactical performance required setting personal concerns aside in favor of operational objectives. Major Jackson, flying Rescue 2, maintained formation discipline while monitoring radio frequencies for any sign of the missing pilots. His aircraft carried enhanced communications equipment and medical supplies configured for battlefield extraction scenarios. Rescue Lead, Rescue 2. I'm monitoring emergency frequencies. No contact with missing elements, but I'm picking up intermittent transmissions that could be ground team communications. The target area appeared ahead of them as a landscape transformed by forces that went beyond normal weather patterns. The valley where Staff Sergeant Morrison's reconnaissance team had been pinned down showed evidence of significant tactical engagement, smoke plumes, damaged vegetation, and the distinctive marks of close air support operations that had been interrupted by circumstances beyond anyone's control. Rescue flight, this is Rescue 3. I've got visual on possible aircraft debris at grid November 7-3 Alpha. Appears to be wreckage consistent with A-10 configuration, but I can't determine pilot status from this altitude. Captain Martinez's report sent a chill through the formation. Finding aircraft debris confirmed that at least one member of Hog Flight had not survived the morning's operations, but it also raised questions about the other missing pilots and whether the tactical situation had deteriorated beyond recovery. Nix descended to investigate the wreckage while her wingmen maintained altitude and monitored for enemy activity. What she found challenged her understanding of both aircraft survivability and pilot resourcefulness. The debris field showed evidence of controlled impact rather than catastrophic failure. Someone had managed to put their aircraft down with enough skill to potentially survive the crash. Rescue 2 and 3, this is Lead. I'm seeing evidence of pilot egress at the crash site. Emergency locator transmitter is active, but no visual on personnel. Recommend we expand search pattern to locate possible survivors. The implications were encouraging and terrifying in equal measure. If pilots had survived aircraft loss, they were now operating as ground personnel in enemy territory, possibly injured, definitely in need of immediate extraction. But locating and recovering downed aircrew in hostile territory required tactical approaches that went beyond normal search and rescue procedures. As rescue flight expanded their search pattern, they were about to discover that the morning's impossible survival stories were far from over. The voice emerged from static-filled radio channels like a ghost finding its way back to the living world. Weak, distorted by atmospheric interference, but unmistakably human. Any station, this is Sledgehammer. Grid November 7-5 Bravo. I have 1 KIA, 2 wounded. Request immediate extraction. Enemy activity increasing. How copy? Captain Rodriguez, call sign Sledgehammer, had been missing for over 4 hours. According to radar tracks and communications logs, his aircraft should have been destroyed when Hog Flight scattered into the storm. But military survival often depended on the difference between should have and did, and Rodriguez had apparently decided that.